Welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah. I'm with the Midwest Writing Center, and I'm excited to have you hanging out with me today. So, um, today, in case you're unfamiliar with the Write More Light web series, once a week I do a short lesson in a specific thing in writing, and once a week I interview somebody who's doing something cool in the art world. Today we're going to talk about identity writing. This is something that I think gets confused a lot in the world, since there's a lot of different ways to write personal stories, for one thing, and then there's something called the persona piece, which is writing an identity that is absolutely different from your own. And that's something we've talked about before a couple of times, and it's also something you have to be really, really careful about doing. So, something to keep in mind. You want to learn about persona? You can search for that on our YouTube page, youtube.com/Midwest Writing Center. But today we're going to talk about identity. And identity writing is different from like the personal essay, or just a poem about your own experience, or a novel that follows this, whatever genre it is that you're into. Something being about the self does not necessarily make it an identity piece. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and say first, when we talk about identity, what we mean is a distinguishing characteristic of an individual. I adapted that a little bit from Merriam-Webster. There are a lot of weird answers in the world that were unexpected to me when you look for definitions on the word identity. That was a real surprise. There were a lot of definitions that I've never heard the word used in those ways. I am a big fan of real dictionaries. I think that it can be weirdly surprising. I think it can be a surprising way to have a good time, is the way you get lost when you're looking up a word, either in etymology or the neighboring words, stuff like that. So highly recommend paper dictionaries. But if you are using the internet, because it's the 21st century and it's easier, Merriam-Webster is preferred by most editors that I know. Actually, all the editors I know. But most that I've seen out in the world. They keep it updated pretty well. They do a lot of good vetting, and they're also really fun on socials, if that's something that you look for in a dictionary. Anyway, so a distinguishing characteristic of a person. So what's important to me is to note, especially when we're writing about identity, when we're writing our own identity, is that we keep in mind that an identity is not a single thing, and what another sees as your identity is not necessarily correct. And most of us have a mixed identity, and that means that the things that maybe we're supposed to identify with, or the way that someone sees us, is not necessarily the only aspect that makes up who we are. It's pretty simple. But a lot of the time, the things that we are asked to identify with, the things that we are asked to call our identity, are not our own choice. And that's interesting and worth exploration, and one of the reasons that identity writing is its own little subgenre. And that's how I started doing identity writing, was just because I felt lost or unseen in the ways that I see myself. And I think that's not unique to me. I think that's a universal experience, and I think that, or more or less a universal experience, and I think that everybody deserves to tell their story of their own identity, like as a matter of course, as a matter of existing. And so I want to encourage identity writing. I think, all sorts of writing are worth writing, and I want to know all the stories. But I think it's a really healthy and helpful and useful tool of both, self-discovery, self-exploration, self-healing, whatever, but also of understanding the world, understanding those outside of yourself, because you can't do that from inside. You have to look elsewhere. Okay. So, multiple things make up most of our identities. There's no. I used to play this little game where I would say, it's not like a real game, but there's 3 or 4 things that you just happen to know about someone the first time you meet them, and those would be the things that we would call their identity. And I've never been like, oh, what's the one thing everyone knows when they meet you? Because that's just like how you look, and that's not one's identity. It can influence one's identity, for sure. I've in fact read some really beautiful essays about how being beautiful has been, essays and poetry about how being beautiful has been actually very harmful for a person. And I would say, most of the time I would be like, oh, poor you. But those pieces have been really moving, and their experiences are not, to be diminished the way that I would have. Like, is it the worst problem to have? Probably not. But it is a valid experience. So, yeah, whatever it is, probably your identity, the way you see yourself, is not visible from the outside. And that's really where the work comes in. The work or the writing of an identity piece is probably in struggle with, grappling with, interrogating the way we are seen from the outside, and trying to make that match what we see on the inside. And I think that is another reason that identity writing is as prominent as it is, or could be more prominent, is because of that, right? There's an inherent struggle, there's an inherent conflict in this thing that involves, few verbs, right? This is internal most of the time, and I think internal conflict is interesting, I guess is what I'm saying. It's worth writing. It's worth reading. So, when we talk about mixed identity, something that comes up a lot is we feel expected to perform only one identity. For example, those who see you from the outside expect something when they see you. I don't have an example ready, so I'm sort of doing a poor job of this. For example, I meet somebody at the store and they expect me to speak a certain way based on how I look, right? And maybe I do, maybe I don't. But when you have multiple aspects to your identity, right, you might do a lot of code switching. Code switching would be, in this context, I understand from my conversation with Caroline Schneider that code switching means something different in linguistic pragmatics. So when I say code switching right now, I mean that the way you speak, the words you choose, the cadence of your language changes depending on the environment you're in and the people with whom you are speaking. So I do a lot of code switching. That's true. The way I talk to, the cashier at the drugstore versus the way I talk to my mom versus the way I talk to my friends versus the way I talk to my boss, they're all very different experiences. No, maybe not experiences, but they're different language sets, language skills, language patterns. And none of them is fake. Those are just different identities owning that conversation. There's also, the piece, I've written a lot of identity pieces, but the piece I'm thinking of is about being being white passing. And what that means is that you look at me and you see a white background, right? A white ethnic background. And this piece is called A New Diaspora. It is about being a second generation Armenian. And when, seen walking down the street or whatever, I'm expected to be engaged and fluent in the dominant culture. But a lot of my life was spent trying to reconcile the differences between, the family I saw at family events and the world that my paternal side came from with, what I'm learning at school or at church or on my maternal side. They're just very different cultures, and I did not feel that reconciliation, and that's what that piece is about. Felt like I was dancing around talking about that, so I just did it. And a lot of people, I would say, particularly in the U.S., we have so much immigrant family in our world that even if we look like the dominant culture, what's informing that is not from a dominant culture. It's from a relatively new place. Of course, there's also aspects of identity in which one must assimilate. Assimilating in this context meaning I'm going to act like the dominant culture in order to survive, in order to fit in order to do whatever it is that I need to do. And that's very common and beautiful, maybe not beautiful, rich area of identity writing as well. And I want to be clear, this doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be poetry, it doesn't have to be prose, it doesn't have to be whatever. I'm always going to say write what comes. But the way that you are seen by others is not necessarily accurate to who you are. The way you see yourself is maybe not accurate all the time to who you are. Identity writing takes those niche pieces of who we are, each of those identities, and maybe one at a time, maybe all of them. I'm not here to tell you how to write. And interrogates them and looks to answer the question, who am I? In writing. So things that we see a lot in talks of identity writing, or just when we talk about identity in general. We hear the word identity politics a lot. Things that tend to come up in those conversations would be racial and ethnic identities, gender identity, sexuality as an identity, affluence, like social class, socioeconomic class, I suppose, as the two are interrelated. There's a lot of gorgeous work out there about being working class, and or about learning other classes, learning your own place in a class system that is perhaps not a caste system. I don't want to be confusing about that, but there's a lot in this world, right? Those are the big ones. There's also that we see talked about a lot right now, but there's also disability. There's also nationality. Nationality would be the country that you are from, or have permanent residence in, and as such is different from ethnicity, which is your ethnic background. And race is there are only I think 3 or 4 recognized races, and they are pretty much exclusively about skin color. But there's so many other things that can be a part of your identity. The music you listen to, the pets you grew up with, the number of family members you saw on a regular basis, the number of siblings you have, um, the weather in the place you were born or the weather in the place where you live, your activity level. I'm sure that we all know somebody who self-identifies as like a gym rat, um, and if they're self-identifying that way, they see that as part of their identity. Identity, again, meaning a distinguishing characteristic of an individual. Um, I know a lot of people, identify pretty hard with philosophies surrounding their diets. That would be things like veganism or paleo, because those are rooted in things outside of just the food. There's of course religion and hobbies. Hobbies. If I spend all of my free time on a craft, outside of work or family obligations, I'm probably going to identify pretty strongly as a maker of that craft. There's, of course, your position within your family. I am a sister, I am an aunt, I am a daughter. Um, so any one of these things and a bajillion more um, can be huge parts of one's identity. Um, your job too. I didn't even include that. One's job can have a huge impact on their identity, especially if it's a vocation, but not necessarily. Vocation here meaning that you do a job about which you are passionate. Um, but I wouldn't say that barista was my vocation, but I do often find myself identifying as a barista because I love coffee and I love the act of making it. And being a barista, also includes customer service and running a cash register and you know multitasking and whatever. Just really anything can become part of your identity, and that's another reason why it's a really cool thing to read and write about, is because there's no limit to the topics discussed under the umbrella of identity. There's just no limit. And I often say that I do, like if someone says, "Well, what do you write?" I often say that I do identity pieces or I write about identity because I don't know an easier way to explain the things that I care about, right? I've, I've, I find it just a really hard question to answer. Like, am I answering about the form, or am I answering about the topic? Um, and as somebody who's not really married to a form, um, I find it easier to say, here's an umbrella term for topics. We all have identity. It's not something that any person just doesn't have. um, I would say probably from the moment you're born, identities are placed upon you, but also you're born within or without a family system. And that's the first place that you start to receive those things. Of course, dozens of other things are put upon you, um, but we can't escape the circumstances of our birth. Whew, okay, so tips and tricks for doing identity writing. If you're somebody who likes to plan stuff out in advance, I want to say first, I'm not. So these are things that I've gone back and I've looked at the reading that I've done and I've looked at the writing that I've done that falls into the concept of identity writing, and picked out the things that show up a lot and the things that if I were doing editing or if I were trying to plan in advance, here's what I would look at. And we'll use me as an example because I am me. I really would like to start doing this with fictional characters, but it was so hard to do that Lion King video, and I just don't feel confident with it. Um, maybe we can swerve. Who is What's like hot on TV? Nobody's here with me. Nobody's gonna answer. Um, you know what? Let's just go with the Lion King again. We're gonna do Simba. So we're gonna sit down and do this with yourself. You can't really write someone else's identity piece for them. Now Simba was born upper class, member of nobility. So his class and his family structure are related. We're going to say prince, right? Which denotes that his life is going to be comfortable, and also that he has some power. He's in a position of power. I would say prince is the primary identity piece here, and those other things are things that go along with being a prince. We know that he is a son. We know that he is a friend. We know that he witnesses trauma. Trauma is often part of identity, and that's unfortunate but true. He witnesses his father's death and believes it to be his fault. So guilt is a huge part of his identity, and that's what causes him to run away. I'm imagining now that just the rest of the videos I make are always going to be about the Lion King. A movie that I have not watched again, even though I talked about it and how long it had been since I watched it. So he's definitely part of the dominant culture, which is important. I would say the lesser classes in his world would be the birds and the hyenas. Definitely the hyenas. We see the hyenas get marginalized, which is also why Scar has such an easy time rousing them to his aid. It's because the hyenas are marginalized. I don't know what kind of... I know there's like multiple kinds of things that I would call a monkey, so my apologies to the world of monkey lovers. I don't know what Rafiki is as far as species, but it does not seem like he is really part of that world. It seems like he is from, a parallel class or a foreigner. I also know that Lion King is based on Hamlet, but my experience with Hamlet is not stronger than my experience with the Lion King, and also if we're strictly speaking about the Lion King, we don't need to do that either. Let's see, he is a friend to Nala. He becomes a friend and or charge of Timon and Pumbaa, right? They take on a parenting role. Which then makes him a runaway. Part of his identity is that guilt, but part of it is in abandoning everything he knew. Maybe he feels a little bit like a pioneer of his lifestyle. I don't know, right? You really have to be the person to interrogate your own identity. And then he comes back and he takes on this role of like savior. And eventually he becomes a father. So any one of those things could be a rich piece of writing, but it's going to be the most interesting when we combine them all, which is not what The Lion King is, but The Lion King does interrogate those things on Simba's behalf. So if I were Simba and I were going to write an identity piece, I would probably talk about my dad a lot. I would probably talk about Scar a lot, my uncle who murdered my father, who manipulated me, who enslaved my family. Because that's gotta feel weird, right? There's also something that goes along with having family who is famous or notorious, having family who's well known, especially for doing something. Right? Scar's well known for... Well, first I want to say he's like a black sheep situation. But then he just usurps the throne and enslaves his brethren. And so there's an amount of that where like me as Simba, I'm probably really proud of my father's legacy, and probably wondering like how much Scar is in me, especially since I spent some amount of time believing that I killed my father. Even if it was an accident, I feel guilty about it, which means probably I think I'm capable of that. So there's a lot to interrogate there. I said that funny. There. And then, of course, finding a new home, right, with these two other outcasts in the jungle. Sorry, went to the song in the jungle. Then, falling in love, having a family, straightening out what went wrong with Scar. Each of these things makes up his identity, and each of these things is worth interrogating. I think the most interesting one is going to be, who am I who runs away, and who am I who returns. So, there's two catalysts there. You can't see me gesturing. There's two catalysts there. We've got the trauma, which informs, running away. And that's a huge, important piece of growth, of the opposite of growth. Like, he became worse for a while before he grew. And then there's the catalyst that caused him to grow up and become better and, become a savior to his people. And those are the things that, if I were Simba, I would want to write about first. Probably, realistically, like, those are the more interesting things that I would want to read. But probably more accurately would be, like, that song, I Just Can't Wait to Be King. That's an identity song, if I ever heard one. Scar's song with the hyenas and the fire is also an identity song. That's a fun thing about, like, cartoon musicals. Every song is really like announcing, here I am, this is what I do. But the thing that I would probably realistically do if I were Simba would be like write an identity piece about eating grub, like, because there's not a thing that is less worthy of attention. It's just like some things are bigger, right? So him eating grub maybe didn't impact his. Maybe it did. I mean, maybe it did. Maybe he learned a lot about like not being a predator animal from this experience, and that's what made him able to be an egalitarian. Hanging out with Timon and Pumbaa made him a better person and better able to be an egalitarian ruler or something. I think probably there's just a ton of content in his relationship with Timon and Pumbaa. Probably can say Hakuna Matata is also an identity song. Yeah, so if we're looking at ourselves, we kind of want to be, you'd never really want to be objective. It's not really possible to ever be objective, but we kind of want to be objective or look at ourselves from far away, from the outside if we can. And we probably don't have to, right? We probably know what people think of us, or at least we believe we know what people think of us. And we either identify with that or we don't. It doesn't fit right, it's uncomfortable, or it does. And how does that feel? For me, the piece that I mentioned, New Diaspora, that was a really big, important piece for me to write. It took me many years to write because it was so difficult for me to really grapple with feeling misfit in my own identity, in those things that I identify with. So that was just too big for me to not do right off the bat. But anymore, I look at the little things, and I do think that they're just a little more exciting in that they're, I don't know, more ignored. So I think of myself, I'm I may have talked about this recently. I may not have. I have been reading a lot of memoirs that turned out to be really memoirs of sexual liberation, and so something I'm working on right now is sort of a response to that, about how an identity that is not involved in sexuality, what does that mean? And also, is an identity that is not involved with a sexuality, therefore, like, an identity involved in not being a sexuality, right? So it's about being asexual. If that was, for whatever reason, I didn't say that bit. And little things like that, which I would say, don't take up a lot of time or space in my life, are in opposition with a mainstream idea or ideal. And that can be really, really fun and really, really rich for interrogation. But something I might look into doing in the future would be like, I used to bite my nails, and that's not something that I consider like a big important part of my identity, but it was a shock to me when I quit biting my nails. And what does that mean? Did people like look at me biting my nails? I don't know. But if I incorporate that, if I say like, this was, part of my daily life, many hours a day, every day for 25 years or 30 years or whatever it was, what does that mean? And what sort of symbolism can we work into there? It really can be anything. I don't introduce myself as like, hi, I'm Sarah, I bite my nails. I don't introduce myself as like, hi, I'm Sarah, I have tattoos. I saw my tattoos on the camera there. But someone else may see that when they look at me, right? And that makes it, valid for interrogation. I really want to emphasize that anything that we do, any habits that we have, any passions that we have, any, regularly occurring annoyances can be great filters through which to examine identity. So that was the first step, really. Find the thing that you want to talk about, and then figure out. And again, I'm not a planner, so this is something that I would be doing in editing. Figure out why that thing is the filter through which to see yourself, and that could be anything. That could be any reason. And it's all about the way you craft it. I would think that it would be a different experience to do briefly, right? To do a flash piece or a poem about identity would be very different from writing a long essay or a memoir. But it is still, those are totally different beasts, but these two things are still necessary to both. Now, the bigger question and the harder one to answer, and probably the thing that an audience wants most, is resolution. And I'm not one to give resolutions. I've written a lot of pieces about identity, one about, and I think everyone has this experience, so it's a good prompt and worth doing as an exercise for yourself. But I wrote a piece about identity, but it was a piece about driving in a car listening to music. And it's pretty abstract, I'll grant. I don't ever say this is the music that made me, but it is, of course, the music that made me, and the experience of driving around listening to music shapes any of us who have ever driven around and listened to music. It's just how it is. When you're coming of age anyway, I'm sure that it is, similar to do as an adult. I'm just not convinced. I feel like we don't have that luxury very often to just exist. So any experience like that or any experience that really opened your eyes to a bigger thing and, helped you become however you see yourself or stop being whatever you saw yourself as, are great situations. The thing that then happens in that editing process is, why is this the I just said the word a moment ago. I don't remember it now. The lens. Why is this the lens through which I interrogated identity? And it can be as simple as, because this is my identity. But you're going to want to know in yourself, why you're sitting with this topic and with this piece, and that's going to come through. I had already covered that. We were talking about resolution. You don't need to have a resolution. Having a reason for sitting down and writing this piece is an act moving toward resolution, as it is. But it's also okay if at the end of the day you're like, man, this is what it is, and I just have to grapple with that, and I have to grapple with it every day. That's fine. That's fine. Only you know when the piece is done, unfortunately. And only you know who you are. I will say, sometimes somebody knows you a little better than you know yourself, but they're not going to be able to write your identity piece for you. Could be a fun practice, though. Have a writing friend and write identity pieces through each other's persona. Not the same as an identity piece, though. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, if there are any other topics that you're into that you'd like to see us talk about, interrogate, etc. The comments work just fine. We also, accept messages. I'm going to give you some real quick updates about the Midwest Writing Center, because we are heading into our busy season, which means fewer updates, to be honest. Because we will be so busy doing events that are pre-planned. So, we're accepting applications through May 15th for the Young Emerging Writers Internship. That is a paid internship for Quad City area writers age 15 to 19. It meets Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday evenings. We learn how to read better, we learn how to write better, we learn how to workshop, and we publish a magazine. So writers get paid, writers get free tuition to the Collins Writers Conference, writers get published. It's a really wonderful experience. It is the reason that I am who I am today. I went through that program as a teenager and left, and always had in my mind that I wanted to do that for other people, and I'm very, very grateful to be here at the Writing Center now, giving that opportunity to more people. We're also accepting applications for the Great River Writers Retreat. That's a retreat, so it's a contest, and the winner will receive a week at the Bennett House, which is a beautiful wooded monastery in Rock Island. Food and drink and board and everything paid, and the winner will also headline their own event. So it's really cool. It's a really wonderful experience, as I understand it, just being able to dedicate yourself to that project. Now, that is for writers who have a project in progress that they want to work on during this retreat. Applications are open for that, I believe, through May 31st. We're also planning the Collins Writers Conference. I'm really excited for giving the big announcement of what's to come, maybe next week. But that is June 22nd through 24th. Very exciting. That'll be at Augustana. It started out when it was the Mississippi Valley Writers Conference at Augustana, and we've been mostly at Ambrose since. Did a couple of hybrid years, hung out at the library. I'm excited. I've never been to a conference, to a Collins Writers Conference. I've never been to any conference at Augustana. So I think that's going to be really, really cool. The faculty are really, really wonderful. I'm really excited to announce them. It's just, it's my favorite time of year. We're going to be expanding our programming and offerings during the conference. I'm, again, really excited to announce everything that we've got going on, but I cannot yet. I think that's all I've got for you. So, of course, today's prompt, I'm going to urge you to put 5 minutes on your own timer, because I am not sitting in such a way that I don't have a notebook near me. I'd have to shuffle around, and I'm not going to do that. So I would like you to start an identity piece. Either if you need a little extra instruction, start with I am, make a list. If you, yeah, that's it. That's your prompt. Set 5 minutes on the timer and start with the words I am. As always, please write more light into your life.